Benjamin Netanyahu begins forming a coalition while fighting criminal charges at the same time. Will his ministers stand by him if he's indicted for corruption? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is Israel's next government. Benjamin Netanyahu has the backing of the majority of politicians in the parliament. He's set to form a government. He's even on track to become the longest-serving prime minister in Israeli history. And it all could fall apart for him if the country's attorney general makes good on a promise to file charges against him in 3 corruption cases. Netanyahu says he hasn't done anything wrong. But that assurance isn't good enough for some of his coalition partners who've said if the prime minister is indicted, they'll walk. That scenario could spark another election. But whoever wins, the elephant in the Knesset is the drastic right-wing turn Israel's leaders have taken in the past decade. So, while infighting among Jewish nationalists is rampant, could the real losers be the Palestinians? We'll debate all of that in a moment, but first, here's Abu Bakr al-Shamahi.
Defying his enemies, Benjamin Netanyahu is edging closer to becoming Israel's longest-serving prime minister and consolidating the right-wing's hold over the country's politics. The numbers are on his side. Netanyahu's planned right-wing coalition grouping won 65 seats in last week's Knesset elections. President Reuven Rivlin has spent Monday and Tuesday getting official recommendations from parliamentary parties.
We came here to the president and delivered to him our position that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, head of the Likud party, should be the one that will be entitled to form the next government of Israel.
We were today at the president, and we, as our party, told the president that we would like that Benjamin Netanyahu, he should be the next prime minister of Israel.
But it won't be plain sailing. Netanyahu's coalition may be on the right, but they all have differences that may be hard to balance, especially when it comes to Israel's religious-secular divide. Netanyahu may also use his new government to push through legislation that protects him from corruption charges. Israel's Attorney General is set to indict him for bribery and fraud in the coming months. And opponents worry about what Netanyahu could be willing to offer his right-wing partners to make those charges go away. The Israeli Prime Minister had already promised to annex settlements in the occupied West Bank, a move that would be illegal under international law. It would effectively make any future Palestinian state impossible. But Netanyahu knew it was a vote winner, and that highlights the position Israel's Arab parties have taken towards the formation of the new government. They haven't recommended anyone for Prime Minister, accusing Netanyahu of anti-Arab incitement and his rival Benny Gantz of not being much different. Many Palestinians in Israel didn't even bother voting. For most, whoever wins, it's bad news either way. Abu Bakr al-Shamahi, the Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio by Ran Bar Yoshafat. He's the Deputy Director of the Coaled Policy Forum and was a candidate for the New Right Party of Israel. In Ramallah, we have Mustafa Barghouti, the Secretary General of the Palestinian National Initiative Party. And in Tel Aviv is Haaretz journalist Gideon Levy. Thanks for joining us, gentlemen. Gideon, let me start with you. Netanyahu is going to form this new government. I'm guessing it's a new government that you're not going to like very much.
Yes and no. I'll surprise you. It can get worse than this government. This government is going to be a government of annexation, a government which will finally declare Israel as an apartheid state. And this has some advantages, not only disadvantages, because the masquerade will be over, as Israel will be declared as having no intention whatsoever to put an end to the occupation, as the occupation will be declared as a permanent phenomena, and as it will be very clear that under the rule of Israel there will be two classes, one Jewish which will gain all the rights and the other one which will have no rights whatsoever, this creates a new reality, both for us Israelis and for the world. And now it's about the world to decide, will he be ready to accept another apartheid state in the year of 2019?
Okay, let me go to our guest in studio, Ran Bar Yoshefat. Good to have you in studio for once.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Gideon Levy says this will be a government of annexation, of an apartheid state. I know you ran, you guys didn't get any seats. I'm delighted to offer you a seat here. You're on the right. Is that what this government will be, that right-wing government? Annexation, apartheid?
I'm not that optimistic about Israel implementing the Israeli law over Judea and Samaria, what you refer to as West Bank. I just think that the definition of apartheid is very odd here, because when you're talking about an apartheid state, you're saying that people who are citizens will be treated differently. Right now, what Israel should do, in my opinion, is implement the Israeli law over Territory C and grant the Arabs there full equal rights. So that's far from being an apartheid. In Israel proper, no one is arguing that the Arabs don't have full equal rights as the Jews. People are saying that the Arabs in Judea and Samaria don't have the same rights as Jews in Tel Aviv, but that's because they're not citizens. If you're going to implement the Israeli law, you're doing the exact opposite. You're saying the Jews and the Arabs in Territory C will be full equal Israeli citizens. The reason why Israel cannot implement the Israeli law over Territory A and B right now is because, one, we have the Palestinian Authority, which in my concept it's a terrorist organization, and because you have 2 million Arabs living there, and Israel is worried about the demographics. But I do hope that eventually, in a period of time of 10 years, Israel will implement the Israeli law over all of Judea and Samaria.
Okay, if there's annexation and if you give everybody equal rights and they're a part of the democracy, would you then accept everybody voting under one state?
Of course, why not? I'm saying tomorrow we can implement the Israeli law over Territory C. That doesn't frighten me with demographics, because all the Jews live in Territory C. We're talking about almost 500,000 people.
Right.
And you have between 50,000 to 100,000, some say 200,000 Arabs. That doesn't threaten my demographics.
Right. Okay, this is fascinating. Mustafa Barghouti, because we've got somebody on the hard right saying, well, you know, essentially the future might be just one state. Is Netanyahu taking us towards that? Might there be a silver lining for everybody here?
I think we are already living in one state with a system of apartheid and discrimination against Palestinians. And racism, which is practiced by Jewish Israelis against Palestinians. And the apartheid is practiced at 3 levels. One level is the discrimination against Palestinians who carry Israeli citizenship inside Israel itself, because there is a certain form of apartheid there, because there is no equality between the Palestinians who carry Israeli citizenship and Jewish people who carry Israeli citizenship. Second level of apartheid is what's practiced against us in the occupied territories. We are governed, occupied, and run by Israel for 52 years, but we are deprived of the right of being citizens. And when your guest from the right wing speaks about equality, he means equality between settlers and Israeli citizens, not between us and Israeli citizens. So he wants to annex the land and exclude us. That is a second form of apartheid. A third form of apartheid is practiced against Palestinians in the diaspora. Every Jewish person born anywhere in the world, in Siberia or New York or anywhere else, can come to Israel and become a citizen immediately. And the 6.5 million Palestinian refugees whose fathers and grandfathers were born here and lived here for hundreds and thousands of years cannot become citizens of this place. So this is a system of apartheid that cannot be sustained. And the only solution is one state with full democratic rights, where I and Gideon Levy and your guest can all vote in the same system with equal rights and equal duties.
So, Ran, one state, democracy where the Palestinians can also make aliyah and go back home?
I just want to make one thing clear. I don't call the Arabs of Judea and Samaria or Gaza Palestinians. I don't consider them a nation. When Mustafa was saying that the Israel proper is an apartheid, it's a joke. When we had a Supreme Court judge who's an Arab who sent my Jewish president to jail, that's not an apartheid. When you have the third biggest party in the parliament who's an Arab party, it's not an apartheid. When you have high-ranking officers, Arab Muslims, it's not an apartheid. Regarding what he said that Arabs in Ramallah and Jews in Tel Aviv don't have the same rights, he's right. But a Jew in Tel Aviv and an Arab in Tel Aviv do have the same right. An Arab in Ramallah doesn't have the same right because we have not implemented the Israeli law over there.
Regarding it's an occupation. It's a military occupation.
It's martial law. We didn't occupy it. There was no Palestinian state. There was no one to occupy it from. The concept of Palestinian nationality is a new concept. But regarding his third argument, about the claim of return, it's the only group in the world that has in their DNA a concept of refugee, meaning if you were a citizen of Germany and a resident of England and you adopted a kid from China, that kid is considered to be a Palestinian refugee. So the whole concept of this is, instead of resettling the refugee issues, is trying to basically dismantle the state of Israel, which has been the goal of the PLO since it was created in 1964, when Israel did not have any control of Judea and Samaria or Gaza.
Okay, and I want to put that aside for the moment because I don't want to get into the right of return debate here because we have other things on the menu for today. I want to kind of circle back to the elections here, Gideon Levy, and sort of look at the big picture. The fact that Blue and White was seen as the only viable opposition to Netanyahu and his allies. This is the party of the former military generals, very hawkish on Gaza and other things. You and you can also correct me if I'm wrong, as a lefty, Gideon, right? As a lefty, progressive, anti-occupation Israeli, you're not just swimming against the stream here, you're swimming against a torrent, right? There seems to be no place for someone like you in Israeli society anymore, Gideon.
Oh, there is a place, but a very tiny place, maybe a public phone box. For me, when it comes to the most crucial issue, and the most crucial issue which really shapes Israel is the occupation, there is really no basic difference between Blue and White and the Likud party. The only difference is in the rhetorics. We had them all for years. Before Blue and White, we had Labor as the founding father and mother of the settlement project, as the founding mother and father of the occupation project. None of Labor, the prime minister, had ever any serious intention to put an end to the occupation. So is Mr. Gantz. He has not a slight idea of what does it mean equality, or what does it mean creating a Palestinian state with equal rights like the Jewish state. And therefore, the differences on this issue, on many other issues, there are many differences. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to this, all the Zionist parties in Israel share the same idea, mainly privileges to the Jewish community over the Palestinian community, mainly maintaining the occupation forever. I cannot live with this.
Mustafa Barghouti, as somebody who has seen a lot and has lived through a lot in different Israeli governments, and I remember talking to you, interviewing you when Ehud Olmert was Prime Minister of Israel, for example. Do you prefer Netanyahu and his Yisrael Beitenu and Shas allies, for example, rather than someone like Ehud Olmert and his Labour liberals? Do you prefer that to be the leadership of Israel?
I prefer clarity. And maybe Netanyahu these days represents clarity, and your guest as well, because they clearly defend the system of apartheid and the system of racism. And in my opinion, there is no big difference between Gantz and Netanyahu, by the way, because both of them represent the same ideas of no place for Palestinian statehood, no place for compromise. Palestinians originally wanted a one-state solution, and they were pressured by the international community to accept that horrible compromise of two-state solution. And we accepted it at our expense. Yet now Israel is compromising the compromise. So we have one or no option but to go back and say, okay, you don't want to allow us to have our own state in West Bank and Gaza, which your guest insists to call Judea and Samaria, then let's live together and be in one state. And it's not true what he said, that there is no apartheid against Israeli Palestinian citizens, because the Jewish law, which was passed by the Knesset, is very clear. It says that self-determination is exclusive for Jewish people. It excludes 20% of the population who are Palestinians. The Jewish law also provides for a statement that Netanyahu repeated many times during the election campaign, that Israel is not a state of all its citizens, but a state of Jewish people only. Well, we are equal in numbers today. If you include West Bank, Gaza, and Israel, together, Palestinians and Israelis are exactly the same numbers, Israeli Jewish people and Palestinians. So how can you have a country, Palestine, which is exclusive for Jewish people, and exclude 50% of the population? The two-state solution offered Israel an option, which is get out of the occupied territories, West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, allow Palestinians to live there in their own state, and then we can have peace between two states. They don't want that because they want the land. And that's why they build settlements that Netanyahu now wants to annex to Israel. That means the death of two-state solution.
Yep.
One thing should be clear. We, the Palestinians, will never, ever accept to be slaves of a system of occupation or apartheid. We will struggle for equality and freedom. One state is even much better than two-state solution.
Ron?
Okay, so I just want to say it's kind of funny because the real apartheid is under the Palestinian Authority. I, as a Jew, would not be allowed in the new Palestinian state. I'm not allowed to territory A and B right now.
No,
there aren't any
that's not
Jews.
true.
There aren't any Jews in the Palestinian Authority, but there are many Arabs under the Israeli parliament. So I really resent the concept of saying Israel proper. As someone who took a big part in legislating the nation-state law, Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people, we need to differentiate between the concept of a nation-state and civic rights. Civic rights in Israel are equal to all. And just like Denmark is the nation-state of the Danish people, and Sweden is the nation-state of the Swedish people, and so on and so forth, if I'll take this same Arab from Judea and Samaria and I'll say, now you live in England
Sweden
or Denmark
is the
or
state
Sweden,
of all its people.
you will still have the same issues of not having a statehood of itself. That is what the law says. The law does not discriminate against citizens.
We have 4 minutes left in this conversation, so I want to ask about corruption, right? And I know we could debate the issue of the rights of the Palestinian Israelis or the Arab Israelis who live within Israel proper for another half an hour. I'm going to set that aside. Gideon Levy, corruption. We still have the Israeli Attorney General, Avichai Mandelblit, saying that he wants to indict Netanyahu. Is that going to happen? Can we see Netanyahu still ending up in jail, and might this whole thing fall apart?
The chances are smaller now than before the elections, obviously, because Netanyahu will try to use his political power and his victory to try to postpone as much as he can. But I think that by the end of the day, he will have to face court sooner or later. But let the legal system, for me, that's the smallest obstacle. I mean, for me, the big corruption is the occupation, not nothing else but this.
And what's going to happen then, Gideon? Can he actually build an indictment-free or a robust indictment-free parliament that would sort of shield him from the corruption charges?
We have to give him the credit that he can do the unthinkable. Because until now, who would believe that after all the charges, he will be re-elected? And here he is, as strong as never before. And I really leave it, everything is open. You know, by the book, he has no chance. By the current law, he will have to resign at a certain stage. Not when he is brought to court, but after he will be sentenced. The Israeli law leaves no room for any doubt. But this can take years, and his partners, the right-wingers, will enable him to stay in office for as long as the court didn't finish, as long as the trial is not finished. This can take years. Right. So, you know, those of us who want to see him out of a position, they should have a lot of patience yet.
Ran Bar Yoshafat, is the message from the voters and from Parliament essentially that you can be our Prime Minister even if you're corrupt, so long as you keep us safe?
Well, hold on. He's not corrupt. He's being accused of corruption.
Even if you're embroiled in massive corruption scandals, you keep us safe,
you are accused of corruption. Now, I'm so proud to live in a country where even the Prime Minister can be sent to jail in case he's found guilty. But I'm also very proud to live in a country that says every person has its day in court. Unlike my neighbors in Gaza and Judea and Samaria that had an election almost 2 decades ago, we are a vibrant democracy. We want to find our corruptions and fix it, but he's accused of corruption. He's not corrupt.
Mustafa Barghouti, final word to you.
Well, he is definitely corrupt. I mean, by the Israeli standard and by the international standard. I mean, everybody, it's not one case. They're talking about 4 cases. But I'm afraid that in the case of Israel, which pretends to be a democracy, The issue of corruption is used also politically. When Omar was about to conclude an agreement with Palestinians, corruption brought him down. He was corrupt, but corruption was used politically to bring him down. Now Netanyahu wants a system of apartheid to prevail, so I do not think that in this case corruption will bring him down, because corruption issue is also used politically by the establishment.
Mustafa Barghouti in Ramallah, Gideon Levy in Tel Aviv. And here in studio, I'm sure you prefer to Skype.
100%, yeah.
Ranbar Yoshafat, pleasure having you here in Istanbul. Thanks so much, gentlemen. Still to come on the Newsmakers, U.S. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar is under fire again. This time she's accused of making light of 9/11. But did she? And stealing, trespassing and damaging property. Are Australia's vegan activists taking things a step too far? Or do desperate times call for these drastic measures? The words "some people did something" put a target once again on the back of U.S. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. Her critics accuse her of trivializing 9/11 with headlines like this one by the New York Post and Donald Trump condemning her comments on Twitter. Meanwhile, Democratic leaders have been mostly silent. Omar's supporters, however, want you to look at her comments in full. She said the Muslim advocacy group CARE was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties. So was she being flippant, or are people seizing any chance they can get to take cheap shots to sell newspapers and score political points? Haider Abbasi reports.
Ilhan Omar has only been in office since January, but she's already challenging the status quo. The 37-year-old is the first Somali American and one of the first 2 Muslim women to serve in the U.S. Congress.
We are not there to be quiet. We are not there to be invisible. We are there to follow the lead of people like Congressman John Lewis and make good trouble.
And some would say she's done exactly that. Last month, she addressed a Muslim civil rights group in Los Angeles.
Far too long, we have lived with the discomfort of being a second-class citizen. And frankly, I'm tired of it, and every single Muslim in this country should be tired of it. CARE was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties.
It was her words, "Some people did something," that caused outrage. Omar's critics say she trivialized the 9/11 attacks and was disrespectful to its victims. Conservative media and Republican politicians were quick to condemn her. Then came this, a tweet by US President Donald Trump showing a video of Omar's speech, edited with the footage of the 9/11 attacks. Journalists and some Democratic lawmakers said the tweet was inciting violence. Omar said she received death threats after the president's tweet. Her supporters say there's more to the backlash. They say she's being singled out for what she is, a prominent black Muslim woman. Conservative commentators have questioned her loyalty to America, and some even say she's an agent of groups like Hamas. Ilhan Omar has gone from one controversy to another. Earlier in the year, she spoke out against Israel's influence on American politics.
I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it is okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country.
She was swiftly condemned as an anti-Semite, even by members of her own party. Others came to her defense, pointing out that criticism of Israel's policies is not necessarily anti-Semitic. But it seems Omar won't hesitate to ask questions that aren't usually heard in Washington. So is the criticism justified, or is the campaign against the Congresswoman driven by racism and Islamophobia? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Let's begin our discussion with Debbie Al-Muntasser. She's the co-founder of the Yemeni American Merchants Association, which is leading a boycott against the New York Post for its front page condemning Ilhan Omar and her comments. Debbie, good to have you on the Newsmakers. What do you think the New York Post was up to? What were they trying to do with that front page?
What the New York Post was actually trying to do is to take down Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. The New York Post has a history of racism and bigotry and Islamophobic reporting for as long as I've known this paper. I personally was one of the people who was actually on the front page of the New York Post, as well as written about on page 6, back in 2007. As the founding and former principal of the Khalil Gibran International Academy, the first Arabic dual language public school in the United States. And so when I saw the image of the Twin Towers burning and them putting together this whole concerted effort against Ilhan Omar, where they actually took her speech, took comments out of her speech, out of context, and actually portrayed her as if though she is insensitive, is very insensitive, not only to American Muslims, but Americans across the United States. And I personally take issue with it as a mother of a first responder who served at Ground Zero for 6 months as a U.S. Army Reserve. It was devastating to see this. And it brought back memories for me of what happened to me in 2007, where I was actually forced out of my position because of their reporting. And so since then, I've actually written a book called Leading While Muslim, which actually chronicles the stories of 14 American school leaders and how they faced adversity in a climate of hate and bigotry and with the high trend of Islamophobia as we see it today.
Okay, so we had the headline from the New York Post. The president goes and amplifies it with his tweet and so on. For a lot of people who maybe don't understand how things work on the ground in New York, you have these, what they call bodegas. A lot of the people who run the newspaper stands tend to be Yemeni. Now, isn't there a counter argument to say, well, that's just American democracy, right? The New York Post is going to do its right-wing thing, and then just next to it, when you go and buy your water and your chewing gum and whatever, you have the choice of getting the Post or of getting New York Daily News, which is going to tell you Trump is a pig or something like that, right? So that's democracy. There's the left wing, there's the right wing. It's all these ideas being put out there. What was so particularly dangerous, in your opinion, about what the Post did?
Well, what is particularly dangerous here in this situation is the fact that they are weaponizing September 11th and utilizing it to basically endanger the life of Ilhan Omar, as well as American Muslims and people of color who may look like they are Muslim. After 9/11, we saw a great deal of backlash and discrimination and the rise of hate crimes. And today, we still see the rise of hate crimes more than ever after a Trump presidency. And so what we see happening here is the endangerment of the lives of Ilhan Omar and American Muslims. And we cannot allow the New York Post, or for that matter, any other newspaper, to do what they are doing. And so that's why we in New York City are very committed to make sure that we are going to hold the New York Post accountable through this boycott. And, you know, we have between 4,000 to 6,000 bodegas, which are small convenience stores and delis across the city that are on board. And we are also recruiting other associations that have bodegas and small delis and stores to join us in this effort. In fact, our office right now is getting calls from all over the city asking for the posters to hang in their windows. We even have New York City residents who are saying, I don't own a business, but I want to have a poster in my window to show my neighbors not to buy the New York Post. And so we are going to continue this effort aggressively until we hear back from the New York Post with an apology to Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, to American Muslims, and people of color who've been victimized by this paper.
Okay. Good to talk to you, Debbie. Debbie Al-Muntasser joining us there from DC. Let's debate these issues now with lawyer and former Democratic congressional candidate Tahira Amatul Wadud and the president of the Conservative Hispanic Leadership Council, Ivan Garcia Hidalgo. Ivan, you heard what Debbie had to say. She said what the Post did was take Ilhan Omar's comments out of context, weaponize them, and put a target on the backs of people of color, Muslims, and Arabs. I guess you disagree, Ivan.
Good afternoon, Imran. Thanks for having me on the show again, and good morning to Tahira. Look, I think this is a complicated situation. I think she has, Representative Omar has, in her short time in Congress, a very provocative way of addressing issues, to say the least. There are a lot of people, including many in her party, who believe her comments and her tweets are anti-Semitic. I think this is something that she needs to address, and you know, if she's being provocative, then she needs to clear the air. And if she's not being provocative, then I guess all the accusations against her of being anti-Semite are in fact correct. But as far as boycotts, look, I don't believe in boycotts. That's something that left-wing organizations and socialists believe in. So, you know, do what you want. I don't care. I don't believe in boycotts myself, but I think Representative Omar has a lot of problems. Her own party has problems. We just saw Nancy Pelosi at a 60 Minutes interview talk about her and Cortez and mention that, yeah, maybe there's 5 of them in Congress. You know, completely dismissing them and saying that the Democrats are not the Socialist Party. Democrats should be in the middle. So, you know, they're on their own. They're you know, you got to understand they're young. They're trying to be provocative, but I think they need to clarify some positions.
Okay, so Tahira, does she need to be speaking more carefully because she's a congresswoman and be less provocative, or was this a manufactured crisis?
It's a manufactured crisis, and it happens all the time to people who are historically marginalized by society. Representative Omar has expressed concepts and ideas that are frequently communicated across many different spectrums of conversation. But of course, she has a target on her back because of her ethnicity as a Black woman, as a Muslim. It's really unfortunate because we talk about having diverse voices at the table. We talk about having diversity in our leadership and those who engage in public service. And then when that diversity is face to face, sometimes we don't like the message that the messenger is conveying. Sometimes we don't like the concept or the idea that those diverse voices are bringing to the table. It's very uncomfortable for the dominant culture. But what we need to do is not ask Representative Omar to clarify or to be less, quote unquote, provocative. What we need to do is to embrace the fact that we have diversity and that the dominant culture needs to recognize and encourage that sort of dialogue, and also to totally embrace proper rules of civil discourse and engagement. Nothing that she has said has warranted the effects of what she is experiencing now. Death threats, attacks, verbal attacks by the president. Let's be real for a second.
Nothing she said. That's insane.
Okay.
Political.
Okay, so
that is absolutely insane.
So Ivan,
how can you say that nothing she said?
What has she said, Ivan, that has warranted the barrage of death threats that she's got?
I'll read her quote.
Okay.
I mean, I'll read her quote. She says, "For far too long, we have lived with the discomfort of being second-class citizen. And frankly, I'm tired of it. And every single Muslim in this country should be tired of it." Nothing wrong with that.
Right.
But then she goes on to say, CARE was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access. I think the attacks on 9/11 is a little bit more than some people did something. If she was just trying to be provocative, like I said in the past. She needs to clear that stuff up. Look, I'm not here, and I'm not a fan of politics of personal destruction. I see how the left plays that every day against my side, against Republican candidates, every single race, every single election. So I'm not a proponent of that. I hate that. I'm one of the guys that you're going to see that will never support that.
Okay, so what's the problem?
Like
then,
I said,
she's saying
if that is her style, she needs
terrible, and the rest of us are paying for it. You're already explaining that you can see where she's coming from. So even if it was not perfectly worded, does it warrant the president
correct. I
ballooning
mean,
the
hey,
situation?
you know what? We're all human. We all make mistakes. We are all human. We all make mistakes.
Does it warrant the death
She needs to
threats?
come out and say, you know what? I shouldn't have said.
Okay.
She should have said, I shouldn't have said some people did something, because that was downsizing a tragedy. The biggest tragedy in American history on American soil, where people killed almost 3,000 American citizens. So it's not some people did something. That was very insensitive. It was insulting. It was devastating. Now, death threats, of course not. I get death threats. I get death threats all the time because I'm Hispanic and I'm Republican. I get, so I don't believe in anybody threatening anybody over discourse. Like Tahira said, we should be able to have conversations, opposing views, and not make it personal, not attack anybody, not try and kill anybody. Of course not.
Okay, so
I don't
ask,
support
okay, so
anybody
ask
trying to kill anybody.
Tahira, might it be that Nancy Pelosi is not rushing to her defense because Nancy Pelosi thinks that she's wrong?
What I think we have is we're experiencing growing pains. We have asked for, complained about, campaigned for, and now we finally have received the reality that Black women, that Muslim women, that women of different demographic backgrounds are at the table. What we are experiencing, not only in the Democratic Party, but across our nation, is the growing pains of how do we make that work in a way that is effective, in a way that is fair, and in a way that is authentic. And so Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leadership, everyone is feeling their way through. How do we do this? It is okay. What is not okay is to have the very heavy-handed, harsh, and unfair response from the Republicans who have manufactured this as a controversy. And let me be clear, Ms. Omar's statements were 20 minutes in length. You can take any sentence, isolate it, and demonize it. That is what we have to resist. There are real tragedies happening in our country. We have, and in our world, we have 50 Muslims massacred in their house of worship. A few months ago, we had a dozen Jewish worshipers massacred in their house of worship. We have real problems to deal with. Whether or not we parse out a logistical conversation around a cause and effect that this speaker was making and blow it up as the greatest tragedy, this conversation being this greatest tragedy in modern history, is unfair. 9/11, of course, you will not find a Muslim or an American who will not tell you that in all of American history, 9/11 was probably the most devastating thing to happen. And so to say that she was minimizing, to say that Muslims would minimize it is inauthentic, it's unfair, and you know that. So let's talk about the real issues. Let's deal with it in a fair way, and let's stop exaggerating and causing barriers and problems for people of color who are taking their rightful seat at the table. Let's stop doing it now. It's misogynistic, xenophobic, and Islamophobic.
Okay, so Ivan, one of the interesting things that Tahira seems to be saying here, within the Democrats themselves, because a lot of the politicians, even though they're liberal, they tend to come from white middle-class backgrounds. Are we seeing with AOC, are we seeing with Ilhan Omar, a truer, deeper diversity at play here of representation, as Tahira talks about growing pains? Very much like you as a Hispanic being a Republican, maybe people weren't too used to this in the past, right? So are we just seeing that on both sides, people are struggling to come to terms with the true diversity of opinion and background that is American democracy?
That's right. But here's the deal, right? Representative Taib from Minnesota said this very correctly. Actually, I think there's one thing I can agree with her when she said the Democratic Party uses minorities. And that's what they do. And she's absolutely correct. When Representative Omar had this problem, which I believe is a serious problem, and instead of coming out and trying to double down and defend her, What we need to do is she needs to step back and correct the record. It's that simple. Everybody is entitled to make a mistake and clear the air. Her anti-Semitic tweets, you know, they've been addressed. The Congress passed a resolution. They didn't name her by name, but obviously they called her out for it. So she needs to come with some clarity about what her positions are. We understand she's a socialist. Okay. I don't think there's any room in America for socialism, but that's another topic. You know, but the Democrats do use minorities, just like they're using Muslim women, just like they use Hispanics, just like they use the blacks. And she was absolutely right calling Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats out. And that's something that doesn't happen in the Republican Party. In the Republican Party, we don't care what color, sexual orientation, or religion you are. We look for people that want to uphold the Constitution of the United States, want to make America great again, and want to keep moving this country forward and make it the best country in the history of the world, which it is. So those are very two perspectives, very two positions in American politics, and we see the differences, right? So, you know, back to Representative Omar, I think it's a very sad situation. Our other guest is trying to exonerate her and make apologies about manufacturing. Her lines are there. Her quote is very clear. If she meant something else, she needs to come out and say she meant something else. But until she does that, you know, the impression that everybody has right now is that she not only is a socialist, but she's an anti-Semite. So that's just reality.
Tyra?
That's not the impression that everybody has. It is the impression that the Republican Party is promoting. It is the narrative that sells support for the Republican Party. And then this assertion that Ivan makes, that the Republican Party takes people where they are and is very welcoming. Please, the Republican Party is lily white. The Republican Party is majority men. Like, stop playing. The Democratic Party is very diverse.
Hey, did you see how diverse our presidential candidates were in 2016 and how white and old your presidential candidates were in 2016? So please don't fall into what you're doing is you're falling into games, into traps and little tricks the Democrats have taught you guys, because you guys have forgotten how to think, and all you do is repeat and play this identity politics crap. You know, you have to step back. You got to learn to step back and speak on facts.
Okay, so Ivan, give Tyra a chance. Tyra,
speak on what's real.
Tyra.
Yes. You're brainwashed by Republican propaganda. It's dangerous. It's insightful. It's inciting violence. I mean, let's also be very direct. Political assassinations, the threats of political assassination are very, very real. Joe Cox, member of Parliament in Britain, assassinated. We're coming on the 3-year anniversary of her death. Gabrielle Giffords, 2011, nearly killed and was ambushed in an attack which killed other elected officials. Women are under attack. In the 1960s here in the United States of America, political assassinations, assassinations of leaders were par for the course. And I'm very, very concerned that we face that sort of a threat when we have this type of attention, negative attention, and sort of provocative messaging by your president, by the Republican Party against a Black woman who is merely trying to engage in her representation of her constituents and her seat as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives.
Okay. Ivan Garcia Hidalgo and Tyra Amatul Wadud, I thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.
These groups, these green-collared criminals who are looking to undermine their livelihood and the economy of the Australian people, then the Commonwealth is totally open to supporting them in a test case to show these green-collared criminals that you don't get to go and pull the rug from under our Aussie farmers.
Animal rights activists in Australia could face up to a year in jail for trespassing. They're accused of breaking into farms and slaughterhouses last week, stealing animals and chaining themselves to machinery to fight against animal cruelty. The protests have divided Australia, a country where barbecue is big business, and Prime Minister Scott Morrison has even gone so far as to call the demonstrators un-Australian. Well, let's discuss this with James Aspey. He's an Australian animal rights activist and former parliamentary candidate for the Animal Justice Party. So, James, you've annoyed the Prime Minister enough for him to go to the extent to call you green-collared criminals, shameful, un-Australian. With all of that in mind, has this vegan vigilantism been justified? Do you feel that you're on the right track?
100%. I think that the animal rights movement is on track. We're seeing huge changes in trends regarding vegan food products, searches on Google. We're finally starting a conversation about animal rights, and that's what needs to happen, because most people never chose to eat meat or dairy or eggs and support all the violence and suffering inside factory farms and slaughterhouses. Instead, they were just born into a culture that does it because that's what they do. And once it may have been necessary to consume animal products, but in 2019, it is 100% not. We know that from the science and studies. And we know that from having technology to create so much delicious food and also to feed the world with plant-based food so we could end so much suffering. And that's what this action has kept up with the conversation. It's got the conversation started in a big way. For the first time, people are able to make a choice because they realize there's a choice to make. Do I want to support violence and oppression and animal slavery and stabbing animals in the throat? Or do I want to just change all that, move to a better system of eating plants and not breeding animals into existence for the sole purpose of murdering them?
Goat farmers are saying you harass them and bully them. Would you consider your movement to be at war with farmers?
Not at all. Farmers are an integral part of bringing food to us all, and we're very grateful for that. We love farmers. We just don't love animal farming. Farm plants, there's tens of thousands of plants that that can be eaten, and we only eat a fraction of them. There's so much demand growing for vegan food, for plant-based foods through plant-based milks and different vegan meats and all the grain and all these different things, that animal farming is just totally unnecessary. So it's not a war against farmers in particular. It's a war, or it's a battle against the enslavement of these sentient beings, these vulnerable, innocent beings who are born into a life of, they're not free and they are forced to do what we want them to do. And, unfortunately, we have to do the right thing. And sometimes that means raiding farms because we need to speak up for the victims. And that is the animals.
And so there's the farm raids and there's the shutdowns and stopping traffic and so on. Despite all of that, as we heard, the Prime Minister calling you some colorful names, and it seems as if the government is wholeheartedly on the side of the animal farmers for economic reasons, for cultural reasons, and so on. So what would your next move then be, given that the government's not listening?
Keep it up, be consistent. They'll have to listen at some point, and I think that's what is actually happening. Everybody is starting to take notice of the animal rights movement. It's an issue that's becoming it's coming to the mainstream, and it's at the forefront of a lot of people's thoughts and conversations and in the media, and that's the whole point. So regardless of what one man who has some power in Australia said about us, and whatever side he's on in particular, I don't expect him to understand or agree, because he's probably paying for these animals to be killed by buying meat and buying dairy and buying eggs. He's coming from a very biased position. If you think about it from the victim's point of view, that removes all biases. Would this Prime Minister like to trade places with any of these animals? What would he feel if it was him being forced down the line at the slaughterhouse? It becomes very obvious what is right and what is wrong.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess, culturally this runs deep. Your very use of the word victim might be a sore point for some people, because they might feel, well, I don't know if you can call these animals a victim, right? And as the conversation starts through your actions and the debates that people will have, if you prove to people that, hey, this factory farming is terrible, the slaughterhouse conditions are horrendous, but they come back to you and say, yeah, I don't like that. It makes me feel very icky that there's a sort of animal holocaust happening every day for my hamburger. But I want better conditions for these animals, but I still want them killed and I still want to eat them. Would that be, I guess, a stepping stone towards something that you might support?
It could be, I support less suffering. So, of course, it would be better not to torture these animal slaves before they get murdered. But a lesser of two evils is still evil. what if we were talking about human slavery? Would it be enough to just make their living spaces more comfortable and to play music while they're doing the work they're forced to do? No.
Right.
Would that be better? Maybe they'd enjoy that a little bit more, but slavery is wrong and violence is wrong. And the point is that this is unnecessary now. It's completely needless. It doesn't have to happen. So I support all the steps whatever it takes to get to the final goal of abolishing animal exploitation, but only purely from a strategic point do I think that you can stop anywhere along the way where we are still doing this in a nice way. No, I don't think there's a nice way to kill somebody who doesn't want to die. And people can call it humane slaughter or a humane holocaust if they want, but the word humane means to show compassion, and there's nothing compassionate about killing animals. Even if they did it in a way where they didn't feel it and didn't see it coming, they're still taking their life against their will. If we killed a human in a way where they didn't feel it or didn't see it coming, but it was against their will, it's still murder. And, you suffer the consequences of committing an act like that. Unfortunately, when it comes to animals, they can't represent themselves. So it's up to humans who see the injustice in this, and a lot of people are starting to realize the injustice in this, to speak on their behalf and to try to explain how horrific it is that currently we are holocausting 74 billion 74 billion land animals and 2.7 trillion sea animals, and every single one of these individuals is an animal just like a human animal. They feel pain, they suffer, they want to live, they don't want to die. They are just fellow earthlings who are trying to make the best of whatever situation.
And that's a discussion that I'd like to invite you back on the show to have, because it might be interesting for a panel, right, to discuss the point of animal suffering, because I think a lot of people still don't get that animals do suffer, and they have this idea that they're just kind of zombies that are there for the killing and there for meat. James, good to have you on the program. Looking forward to having you back on the Newsmakers. Thanks for joining us. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, polls are closed in Indonesia's presidential election. Will current President Joko Widodo beat his longtime rival, or is a new era opening in the country? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.